Hello.
Hi.
Hi, folks. My name is Sarah, and I am the Education Assistant at Dunlop Art Gallery. Welcome to tonight's program, Film School, Black Activist History. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge that Dunlop Art Gallery and FPL Film Theatre are situated on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Laurie Townshend is joining us from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit. And connecting with us shortly, Alexa Joy is joining in from Ottawa, the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. All right, I'd like to take a moment to introduce Laurie Townshend, tonight's presenter. Writer, director, educator, and photographer, Laurie Townshend credits her mantra, "You have as many hours in a day as Beyonce," for her ability to make groundbreaking films while successfully lobbying her 8th graders for coolest teacher nods. With a thematic lens aimed squarely on acts of courage made visible through crisis, The Railpath Hero from 2013 features a spellbinding performance by Stephan James, Selma Reyes-Bialstreet, in a story about the threads of resilience that hold a young athlete's life together in the wake of childhood sexual abuse. Laurie's take on human connectedness is explored in Human Frequency Street Dogs 2014. Award-winning Charlie from 2016 connects the work of late civil rights activist Charles Roach to today's Black Lives Matter movement. And currently, Laurie is in pre-production on Mothering in the Movement 2022, a coming-of-middle-age saga that follows Stacey Ann Chin, Brooklyn's most outspoken poet activist and poster mom for radical Black parenting, as she raises her daughter Zuri while investigating the past of her own mother who abandoned her as an infant. Welcome, Laurie.
Thank you so much, Sarah. It's so great to be here, to be back with the RPL Film School family for this March installment. I'm super excited to introduce our special guest and my wing person for the night, Alexa Joy. Hi, Alexa.
Hello, Laurie. How you doing?
I'm going to tell you a little bit about Alexa before we get into it. Alexa Joy continues to push the boundaries of social thought and public discourse, urging consumers of media to think critically in a time that commands attention for social justice and accountability of those in power. Joy's work amplifies Black voices, critical race theory, and inquiries of race and intersectional oppression. Joy's career started in Winnipeg, formerly as the founder and president of Black Space Winnipeg, advocating for Winnipeg's Black communities. Joy gained notoriety for developing platforms to support Black people across Manitoba while fighting anti-Black racism. She is also the founding researcher of the Critical Race Network at the University of Winnipeg, festival director for the Afro Prairie Film Festival, the Prairie's first Black film festival, and equity consultant and educator. Joy's contributions have been recognized through CBC's Future 40 Under 40, and she is the recipient of the 2017 Sybil Shack Youth Award for Human Rights, Manitoba Human Rights Commission, and is currently a graduate student at the New School for Social Research in New York, and fellow editorial intern at Public Seminar. Joy has dedicated her academic and professional career to breaking down systems of oppression while encouraging radical discourse in mainstream media to enact real change. Amazing. Welcome, Alexa.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it. It's a beautiful just summary of your journey so far. I can't wait to ask you a little bit about it. So before we get into the actual program of the Akua Benjamin Legacy films that you're going to be seeing tonight, or not be seeing, we're going to be discussing, you'll see clips of them. I'd love to ask you, Alexa, a little bit more about your work and that dynamic bio we just read. It seems that you have a lot in common with Akua Benjamin, the individual who commissioned these films that we're going to be speaking about tonight. You know, you have something in common with her and a lot of the activists that are celebrated in this series. And that is the strong sense of community and a strong sense of how to go about building community. I always wonder if activists see themselves as fulfilling a need to build, which implies creating something new, Or is it about cultivation, or is it about preserving, or perhaps it's some combination of all three of those things? How do you think about community, particularly with respect to the projects that you've spearheaded?
I mean, thank you. That's a beautiful question. I think you kind of summed it up. I think it's encompassing all three of those components. For example, like I started Black Space because I wanted to really challenge and burst this Canadian bubble that, we always hear it's so much better in Canada for Black people. And I knew growing up in Manitoba and seeing the overwhelming demonstrations of anti-Blackness, that it's not better, either in the prairies or Ontario. It doesn't really matter where we are in this country. But when I started, I was really interested in just like, first of all, dismantling this facade in Manitoba and really trying to understand what happened in Winnipeg before Black Space. I'm realizing both with my work with CBC and at the New School that we never really just magically end up here. Someone has always paved the way. I think of all the people who lost their jobs or their social status for simply just voicing things that I can say now without, who knows, maybe I can lose my job, but you know what I mean? Like,
no, absolutely, yeah.
People who dedicated their lives, those we know and who we don't know, to Black liberation in Canada. And yeah, I think that throughout my work, I've always tried to honor the past while also, providing some strategic direction for the future.
Mm-hmm. I probably could have added, just listening to you talk about your work with Black Space in particular, I could have perhaps added the term, the verb mobilizing community as well. Because there's this activation of members in a community when they're gathered together and working toward, a common goal. So I'm really happy that I asked that question, and we found out a little bit more about the history, the basis of your work. One more question. Okay. You had a chance to watch the 5 films, the 5 shorts, yeah? So as you all know, audience, if you've watched the films, they profile 5 different activists, Canadian activists who are no longer with us. Actually 6, because the last film's about a couple. Rosie Douglas, Marlene Green, Dudley Laws, Charles Roach, Gwen and Lenny Johnston. So Alexa, with whom do you most identify and why?
Oh my God. I mean, that's a hard question. I think there's a piece of them, all of them in the work that I've done. Because we've seen, for example, Marlene Green. It's really interesting. I'm doing a talk on Saturday, and I'm highlighting a school board trustee by the name of Inez Stevenson in Winnipeg, who was the first Black Manitoban to hold office and the second Black woman to hold office in all of Canada. And I had no idea that she held that title, because why? We don't know about Black activism and Black Canadian liberation movements until like kind of most recently. In my work, even at the University of Winnipeg, I was really passionate about, promoting Black history and how do we not forget the people who gave themselves to the movement. But it would be hard for me to just pick one person. I really appreciated Douglas's radical take. He was like, prolific, to say the least. Like I appreciate that, because I don't mince my words either. When I'm talking about anti-Black racism and anti-Black violence, what good is that to sugarcoat our trauma? So I don't sugarcoat shit when I'm in any kind of conversation. So I really appreciated his radical advocacy, but all of them were radical in their own sense. And I think we also challenge this idea that, Black folks are monolithic, and clearly we're not. We organize. I say this, I've said this in the past, we're all writing the same book, but we're, starting at different chapters, right? So, Douglas is working on chapter 3 and Marlene was working on chapter 6. Either way, the book will get done. We're writing to the same goal.
Wow.
And I think that first of all, before this event, I didn't know these people existed. That's inexcusable. And that's not on the fault of Black Canadians. That's on the fault of the government, of the education system, of the media. I work for CBC. I have a show called Uncensored. And let me tell you, they have a lot of work to do in making sure that folks like you and I have the platforms and just getting out to community. For example, even there are artists that have passed in Winnipeg that Canada doesn't know, because institutions like CBC and NFB and all of these other, organizations that unfortunately sometimes do only prioritize Ontario. So being a man, we have to try to facilitate resources out of this Ontario-centric perspective. But at the same time, you can't take away the history and the richness of Black mobilization in Toronto. They met and out east, like there's just so much too that we don't know. And it was interesting let me go back to my notes. Which movie was it? I think it was Marlene Green. There was one gentleman who said, the civil rights was happening in the States, but in Canada, there was nothing. And, even the fact that he said that, because it's not that he didn't know what else was going on. It's just like, we had no idea. There's such an erasure of, Black mobility and advocacy. And even too, in the other films where there was commentary that Black folks who immigrated to Canada were like the less desirable immigrants. We come here, we pour ourselves on the line. My grandma too, domestic worker in home care. And, we're disposed of. And particularly, we might get into this later, but I think something that I try to be very conscious of in the present too is this idea challenging gender in Black advocacy, because the films were about predominantly Black male leaders other than Marlene Green. And I think what we've seen in the past is a lot of Black male advocacy and leadership. But currently, in like the contemporary Black Lives Matter liberation movement, it's Black women and Black queer folks who are really
very centered,
who have always been organizing. But
absolutely,
I think now, even too, with Philip Pike's film Our Dance Revolution, we really need to see a shift, kind of a narrative, not letting go of the past, but saying these are the other Black people that you forgot to recognize.
Yeah, and just recognizing how easy it is to put a patriarchal lens on, on our histories. It's really quite easy to do because we're so conditioned to do it. And we have to keep each other in check. I think that's super important. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. So you're a combination of all these folks we're going to be talking about in a little bit more detail. And just to clarify, Gwen Johnson was also featured, so she'd be the other woman. But I'm sure there were discussions about that. When I was pulled in to participate in this project by executive producer Allison Duke, these were the names that were curated by Akua herself, and so we didn't have much choice in who we were going to. And this is not to sound apologetic in any way. It's just to explain a little bit of the process. It was quite an interesting moment when these names were put out on the table, and Allison had taken it upon herself to assemble 5 directors to each take on a different film. And you would think that with 5 of us sitting there, in some cases it was like the first time, we were meeting each other. You'd think that there would have been some sort of just commotion and chaos in deciding who was going to, take on which activists. But it was so interesting and so organic how it kind of just, it's like the activists chose us in a way, like I remember Sarah Michelle Brown saying, "Oh, I have this textbook that was found in my in my relative's basement or something like that, and it's an old geography textbook from the Toronto District School Board, and it describes. I don't want to give too much away because I mean, we won't see that part in the film. So if you haven't seen the short, Sarah Shaw Brown's Book of Love, you won't know what I'm referring to. But she reads an excerpt, or an excerpt is read from this textbook, and it's horrifying the way Black people are described in this like archaic textbook. Anyway, so it was the moments like that where she was like, I have a really strong connection to the bookstore, and I would love to do Gwen and Lenny Johnston. And then I was like, well, my dad was a lawyer. I'd love to do Charles Roach. I think he actually might have known him. And everyone kind of just gravitated to their person. And that was how the project came to be. So I don't want to take up too much more time because we're going to get into each film. The plan tonight is to show a brief clip from each film. And I've generated a few prompts for each clip that may or may not lead to riveting discussion. I'm sure it will. You've already seen how the flow is here between me and Alexa. And so viewers, we'd also like you to engage. So please type your comments, thoughts in the comment section. Alternatively, you can use hashtag RPL Film School and at RPL Film Theater on Twitter. And Sarah will be monitoring that in the background and reposting your questions and comments. And don't worry if you haven't seen the films yet. View Kavoo has made these short films available on their platform for free until March 8th. So all you have to do is sign up for a free View Kavoo membership, and the link to view the films will be posted in the comments section as well. Okay, it's probably happening as I speak. So about these films. Known collectively as the Akua Benjamin Legacy Project, these 5 short films celebrate the lives, the work, and commitment of 5 Black Canadian activists. The films, executive produced by Alison Duke, who I've mentioned earlier, focus on anti-Black racism and resistance and seek to instill a sense of history and pride for the significant contributions of Black Canadians to the younger generation of activists and our activists-to-be. The films were commissioned by Akua Benjamin, who in 1988 became the first Black faculty member in the School of Social Work at Ryerson University here in Toronto. Even before this appointment, though, Akua's academic work had always run parallel to her activism in the Black community. In 1970, as a new immigrant to Canada, she joined a group advocating to stop the deportation of Rosie Douglas after he was found guilty of obstruction of justice for his involvement in a sit-in protest against the racist treatment of Black students at Sir George Williams University, now Concordia University in Montreal, Quebec. Tonight's first clip is from the short film Rosie, the Fearless Rebel, directed by Sonia Goding-Togobo. And before we see this clip, let me just say one other thing. In this clip, you're actually going to meet Akua Benjamin, who speaks about leaders like Rosie, what they meant to young Caribbean students in Canada at the time. Rosie Douglas helped these young people understand a concept that still gets overlooked or even denied today, and that is that all oppression is connected. He was able to articulate how the oppression of Caribbean students in Canada, the oppression that they were experiencing, he was able to connect that to the exploitation he'd witnessed in the Caribbean, in Dominica in particular. So I think that's a really important thing for us to unpack when this clip has played.
We who were new students, new to Canada, trying to find our place in the society, we really looked up to him at his, what we call from the Caribbean, being bold-faced.
White people go into the Caribbean, we spread the red carpet for them in the Caribbean. When we come here, you all treat us as dogs.
We were not the preferred immigrants. We were at the bottom of that list of immigrants. And after your tenure here, it was seen that you would leave this country.
Why are you so involved with Canada and the problem of colored people here?
Well, first of all, I am a Black man. And if there are Black people here, I am going to be involved in fighting with Black people. Further, having been born in the Caribbean, an area where the Canadian people are exploiting in the most vicious and blatant form, it is my responsibility while I'm here to expose this type of exploitation.
We began to kind of really, listen, follow his leadership, and began not only to kind of be educated, but began ourselves to take on the educational institutions.
The rules
for the clip. And so, yeah, like, how important do you feel it is, Alexa, for young people today, for anybody today, to understand the interconnectedness of oppression that happens close to home and, around the globe?
Well, I think that the work of Mr. Douglas was very prolific because, first of all, I have to say that it also ties into this strong narrative of Caribbean rebellion. Like, we all know the plight of Haitians. Douglas is from Dominica. My family's from Jamaica. And there's this real take no shit attitude across the diaspora, but particularly with the influx of Caribbean immigrants to Canada. A lot of them really were pioneers in kind of this radical discourse that we've seen throughout Black Canadian and just generally Canadian history. So I think it's important for both people my age, younger, and older to know, because probably a large portion of Canadians don't know who Rosie Douglas is. And I could say that confidently because I know when I grew up, I have not heard of this man. And it's another practice of institutional exclusion and systemic erasure around Black leadership and advocacy in Canada. And his story, like, what he spoke with such, I don't even know if passion is the word. Like, his words really stuck with you and struck you in a way that I'm sure, sparked so much action to mobilize and really affect change in Toronto at the time. So I don't think that, I know for all the Rosies and the Marlenes and, the leaders that we don't know, there's thousands of more that, like I said, either protested publicly or privately, that we need to know about. And it's our job as like creatives and journalists and filmmakers and educators to really make sure that these folks' legacies live on.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking, as you're talking about the global presence of, white supremacy and patriarchy, and how, if we don't do the work of making those connections, of connecting those dots between what might be happening locally and what might be happening in the Caribbean or South America or West Africa or Europe, we fail, we risk not understanding how white supremacy operates. Like, it's so it's so pervasive, and I feel like, maybe there's something protective in that, because sometimes it can seem so overwhelming and so incredibly imposing to think about fighting the different tentacles of white racism, however they manifest.
Right.
But I don't know, there's just something very, very powerful, I guess, in recognizing the pattern for me. And as a teacher, I try to connect those dots as much as possible with my students. I don't think that you're ever too young to understand that, like, I can take it down to their level. The bully who is, picking on so-and-so in the schoolyard, that behavior is connected to bullying that has happened elsewhere, most likely, in that bully's home, or they've witnessed that type of bullying somewhere. So kids really get it. They understand that, oppression and, an attempt to erase the other, or even an attempt to other another person or group of people, is a pattern. It's connected to a long, long, long history of erasure and oppression. So thank you for your input on that. Are there any questions or comments that I should be noting in the chat? Let me see. Okay. All right, let's move on to, thanks, Sarah, getting some back channel feedback here. Awesome. So let's move on to the second clip. This clip is from director Director Ella Cooper's Where is Marlene Green? And you mentioned your connection to Marlene Green and just the things that you heard in her story that resonated with you. Green challenged that the issues identified in the school system would not be addressed with a multiculturalism approach. And that's, using the air quotes, multiculturalism. We're such a multicultural society. This multiculturalism approach of accepting cultures generally, because what was truly at issue in schools was race and racism. Fast forward to 2017, where a report towards race equity in education, James Turner, or the authors of that, James and Turner, states as its first of 80 recommendations that we publicly acknowledge that anti-Black racism in education exists. So this report that came out in 2017 made a point of, naming this thing. And ensuring that language was part of the report. I just thought that was an interesting, speaking of making connections across time and space, Marlene was very clear about that as well. So this clip we're going to see, I have a little prompt, a question that I'll ask after. So let's cue the second clip, please.
So the Black Education Project was this organization that was set up and run by Black people, and there were allies also, to address certain inequalities in the system, namely the education or the lack thereof of Black children in the school system.
Because it was assumed that they were performing below the actual performance. So in recognizing these barriers, the Black Education Project was attempting to deal with some of these issues by working with the communities and also working with the education system.
So in January's film school, I quoted Angela Davis. This was a focus on radical mothering. And I'm going to quote her again. In a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. How has this shift in language, in naming systemic racism specifically as anti-Black, changed thinking, behavior, and or approaches to confronting and dismantling racism? How's language and the shift in language really played out?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Words are intentional and they're powerful. So the fact that she even challenged this discourse of multiculturalism is really important because, like we've mentioned before, Canada likes to sweep things under the rug and sugarcoat shit. So when she was like, actually, no, we're talking about like Black students and how they're suffering in the education system. And naming that, I think, is incredibly powerful because even just the term Black is controversial, right? And I'm sure at that time organizing, she was probably in a lot of different spaces, the only Black woman pushing for this advocacy of Black students in the education system. But I think that naming is so crucial to, first of all, identifying the problem. Canada's gotten away with so much because we refuse to identify systemic racism, or we have code words for it, or we don't have research, like statistical, empirical, qualitative, and quantitative research for addressing anti-Blackness. And it's only recently, and I know this because I've sat in these rooms with these executives and these politicians with their bullshit, saying that we do want to do better for Black Canadians and Black communities, but we're too, I think, quick to give hope sometimes to the system. And what I'm learning in sociology specifically is that there's nothing wrong with the system. It's actually doing its job. It's working the way it's supposed to.
It's working the way it's designed, yeah.
It's keeping us out intentionally. So now that I've come to terms with that, I'm just like, okay, cool. we can strategize around that. But
I love that you're smiling while you say this.
yeah, because it's like,
I know it's not a smile of, anyway, continue.
it's not, but I'm still in my 20s and I'm too cynical to be this young. And I'm just so, I've come to terms with how the system is. I'm not saying accepting the bullshit, but I've come to terms with it, right? Because same too with white people collectively. I've accepted them for how they move and who they are collectively. Individually, maybe that's another story. But collectively, we've seen how they move from generations. Okay, I think it's safe to say. So when we're talking about naming things like anti-Blackness, that gives us the language not only for our rebellion, but for our liberation, for our revolution. But we have to be careful too, because what do non-Black folks do? They co-opt our language. They take from us. They take from our culture, from our intellectual property. And we know this even through music alone. And to bring up hip hop, how many times have we seen people, Black folks, Black artists, get robbed of their intellectual property and get nothing in return? Yeah. So because also Black women, Black queer folks, Black feminism gives us the language for anti-oppression, for intersectional discourse, right? Any misogynoir, intersectionality, I could go on and on, comes from Black women and Black queer folks, right? So I think that we have to continue to naming the problem, but also be careful that our language does not get co-opted, and then we get no credit for our work.
Yeah, and there's something else that happens to language, and that is it often, with overuse or mindless use, it gets emptied of its power. Exactly. You know, it's like the word love. It gets emptied of its potency.
Yes.
And I think that's something else we have to be mindful of. That when we're using words, we're choosing our words carefully, and we're being really deliberate in our word choice. Language is the operating system of our brains, you know, of our minds. And so the language that we use and formulate is actually, you know, it's directing behavior, it's directing thought. And I don't take that lightly. You know, language, it has divided nations. Language has brought people together. Language has started revolutions and has, ended wars. And so I definitely think there's power in it. But I definitely hear your caution and your warning that we have to be stewards of these terms that we take on and that we use to describe ourselves and our communities and the resistance. Was something else I was going to ask about education. Well, I mean, yeah, the system. You talked about the system just being like, running like the way it's been designed. It's just chugging along, and it's so interesting being a teacher and being part of the machinery in some way, but then also realizing that I think I got into this gig because I wanted to be, that whatever it is that you slip into a machine to stop it from working, a way of subverting the whole system and doing that in my own way. It's definitely difficult because there basically has to be an acknowledgement that the system is broken, and it has to be acknowledged by the builders and the stewards of the system, and that's the hardest thing. You see a lot of Band-Aid solutions and things being thrown at the problem, the number of Black students that are suspended and the disproportionate number of Black students as young as kindergarten who are being suspended from school, or like harshly disciplined in ways that their white counterparts aren't. It's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The streaming of Black kids into at the time when I was growing up was general level courses that could never were not prerequisites. You couldn't go to university with general level courses, and a lot of my peers were just, this is what you should apply for, and they didn't know enough to ask questions. And their parents, being new in some cases to the country, didn't know the difference between what general and an academic level course was. So yeah, there's so many things that I've witnessed as a student and now as an educator that lead me to believe that this system it has a long way to go. And I really wonder what Marlene would be saying today about the changes, and about how virtual school and this whole virtual, and how equity plays out in the virtual space, how that's actually affecting the education system and Black kids in particular.
Yeah.
Importance of race-based data. There's that too. There's a lot in naming a problem, but if we don't have data to back it up, or to help us sort of understand the nuances, that can be an issue. So I'm really happy to see that the TDSB and other boards are actually collecting race-based data, and that's where the report in 2017 it came out of that, I believe. Yeah. Okay. Wow, it's already 8:37. We have to move on. The third film by, I was going to say my friend. I could have said that for everybody. Sonia, Ella, Gaddy, Sarah. I'm so happy to say are my sisters, and in film, and it's been so wonderful getting to know these individuals. Dudley Speaks for Me is directed by Gaddy Conti George, and Gaddy made this film. Where the clip we're going to see is actually featuring an educator, Thando. What is her last name? I should know this. I don't think I have it. Maybe it comes up on the screen. I'll look it up. But in this clip, Thando states that Dudley Laws spoke for the voiceless. And I want to talk a little bit about that when we come back. Okay, so this is clip 3.
People who stand up in the face of adversity and who speak out when no one else is speaking out. He was the voice for the voiceless. Dudley Laws. He had a very commanding and compelling presence. He would not just speak with vigor, but he would speak from that emotive standpoint where people could really understand, feel what he was saying.
One cannot be totally satisfied until you see changes on the streets, changes within the courts, changes in institutions.
And he was able to speak with urgency. He was able to speak with clarity about what should be done. Hence the reason why he became appointed the spokesperson and the face of the Black Action Defense Committee.
Thando Hyman. Yeah, so while I understand what folks mean when they say this, when they refer to the voiceless, I'd like to challenge this notion a little bit. Do you think that anyone is really voiceless, or are they, in the words of author-activist Arundhati Roy, deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard? That's one of my favorite quotes from author Roy. What do you think about this term, the voiceless? And then let's also speak about what an honored position it is to actually be the voice, that's pushed forward or celebrated as the voice of the voiceless. Let's talk about that term.
Well, I agree with that quote. I think that, and I think that's something that activism helps illuminate in people, is that you do have a voice. And you do have power to change. It was it Dudley or Rosie who said that what did he say? He said a powerful quote. I should have wrote it down. But basically along those lines in the films, like we're here. Like, you can't take away our power. You can be that's what it is. You don't have to be a politician or a CEO to enact change. Look at all of the leaders who came before us. They're folks who were tired of the anti-Blackness in their community, and they did something about it. That's how I started off in activism. But I think sometimes, especially when you're in very isolated regions like Manitoba, it's very courageous and difficult at times to be vocal about the bullshit in your community. When you're the only Black person in the classroom or your work or the mall or on the bus, you're in a particularly vulnerable position. And I think when we voice these types of injustices, that we embark on a very important mission. I didn't have a rule book to be an activist. I just knew that I was tired of this facade in our community. But I think that everyone does have a voice, but like you said, it's the institutional barriers too. Like, I was doing mental health advocacy back home, and there's a lot of people in our community who just who just lack confidence because of stereotypes, systemic barriers, and the procedure of anti-Blackness, that they don't feel comfortable to voice their opinion, especially not in the presence of non-Black folks, for sure. So I agree with you. I would challenge this idea that there's only one spokesperson, but when you get to a point in your activism where you want the best for your community, it can take a toll on you. So it would be really interesting too to look at these activists and work through any kind of burnout or trauma, because this work is liberating but exhausting at the same time. And I've seen people, particularly last year, leave organizations, leave the movement, because we also have to protect our mental health, and racism statistically kills us earlier, right? Then it's so ingrained in our society that it shortens our lifespan. So we have to be careful of how much we give ourselves to the movement, because I definitely gave too much of myself, for my community. But I think what each activist in the film highlight is that you don't, like he said, you don't need to be a billionaire to enact change. And we all know that change really only happens on a systemic level when there's pressure from a grassroots voice.
Mm-hmm. I love, Alexa, that you injected some compassion in talking about the quote unquote voiceless, because what I heard in what you said was that there's a vulnerability, and sometimes, and not sometimes, I would imagine very often, a fatigue, a despair, and it's not always safe.
Yeah.
It's not always safe. It's not, definitely not always comfortable, but it's not always safe to speak. And so just taking a second to think about that, and to think, like Gaddy titled this film "Dudley Speaks for Me," because that was a slogan that, ended up on t-shirts, and you watch the whole film, you see, that's what the demonstrators and protesters were chanting. And there's something so beautiful and powerful about the chorus of voices saying who they've appointed to speak for them. That to me is like, I don't know, it makes me emotional to think about that. Like the weary and the fatigued and the hurting and the grieving people in the masses, in that massive, in the masses were saying, Dudley speaks for me, Dudley speaks for me. And I think that's a pretty powerful moment, because it shows them using their voice, their unified voice, but then it also shows their agency in assigning their spokesperson, or there's another word I'm looking for, but that idea of like bolstering him and putting him up there.
Yeah.
I think that's pretty cool.
it's like you said, to be recognized as a community leader or to speak for the people is a real privilege.
Yeah.
It is, but it also, you're also in a vulnerable position as a leader as well. It's much easier for people to tear down a hero, you know.
Yep.
So these folks did not have, none of us, we have light work, you know, in our career. But two, something I wanted to highlight was the chants that I've heard in each film. We still use those chants. Like when we did Black Lives Matter rally, like I was just like, oh my God, like you said, that use of language, we revitalize it and we contextualize it and use it contemporarily, because I've heard those chants, I've said those chants before, and I always wondered, where do these chants come from? And you know, they come from our generation. Like, that was the eye-opening moment, because I'm like, wow, like we're really, and it also speaks to the fact that have things really changed, you know? We're saying the same thing they were doing in Toronto in 1970s and 60s. And, eye-opening.
It is really eye-opening. And you've provided a perfect segue to speak about the film that I was honored to direct, Charlie, because that was really something that stood out to me in my research of him, just how much a part of the lineage, this through line, you know, the work that he did with I'm going to
racism.
There's a direct line between the work that he did and the Black Action Defense Committee. Thank you. I was trying to remember the acronym BADC, and BLM today. So in making this film, I remember being struck by how seamlessly Charles Roach moved between grassroots organizing, the halls of academia, the court system, poetry cafes, and the streets of Caribana, which he co-founded. He led what appeared to be a fully integrated life, where advocacy and business and music and family and community were always in play. And so I want us to take a look at this clip and talk a little bit about that integrated life of an activist.
Down on you. Charlie Roach was more than just a lawyer who wore the suits and was at his desk and arguing big cases, but actually was grounded in community, who led protests, was on the blowhorn, but also could navigate within the court spaces and also engaging with media in very strategic and effective ways. Carrion crows circle the ground, shrapnel flash cover the ground.
I fight injustice. So yes, I am obsessed, because I think morning, noon, and night, when I have my breakfast, when I have my dinner, I keep thinking all the time, what can I do to bring about equal dignity of all persons?
The blood is yours, the oil Uncle Sam's, but an oil stained the desert sand. The blood is yours, the oil Uncle Sam.
It's not about what a person have, but it's about the person themselves. It's who they are. And when you find you have someone in that caliber that is there for you as a person, Charlie gives me all of that. Because I know Charles Roach was one of those ones who wasn't afraid to go out in the street and march in the street for justice for all.
Resist.
Yeah, the Renaissance man. You see him there serenading his office, his staff. So I would imagine that you know a little bit about wearing multiple hats, Alexa. What are the conversations you and your fellow leaders have when it comes to self-care and avoiding burnout?
Oh gosh, what a good question. I don't know how to answer that quite yet. I'm still trying to figure that out. It's funny. I spoke a few months ago with Desmond Cole. I'm sure you know Desmond. And I was very open. I was like, you know, I don't think I want to do this anymore. Like, I'm tired. And I think that's something that we don't hear enough activists say. And even like when we saw this like huge movement from George Floyd last year and in the death of Regis Paquette. Like, a lot of younger people, and I say younger like I'm old, like late teens, early 20s, were like stepping up to the plate, because if we're getting tired and we're in our mid to late 20s, there's not much hope. Like,
Wow.
to keep the torch burning, because this is never ending, exhausting work. But the way I try to practice self-care, like these talks, they re-inspire me. They really do. Sharing perspectives. I'm also a musician, so thank God for music and dance and the pool and the gym. Like, thank God for that. But I think that, and Charlie, I loved his energy. You can tell that he was just so humble and genuine in his character, and he really cared about the people around him. Like, he was so he felt like a grandfather figure, and I did not know this man. And how you folks captured that on film was really powerful. Like, to just see how intimate he was. Like, I think oftentimes too, as activists, we're just supposed to put on this face and be hard and be the strong Black man and woman. And the fact that you almost took down those, you expressed his character differently, and provided texture in a way that was so warm and inviting. And not to say that the other people weren't warm and inviting, but he was just like, there was something so comforting. I don't know. Maybe he just reminds me of someone I know, but I really appreciate how each activist was depicted. And two, it kind of highlighted their own narrative, how rebellious or strong that they were in their activism. So I think that, and it's something that's crazy too. A lot of the people, passed before their time. They were relatively that old, which is also speaks to how we quite literally give ourselves to the movement, our lives. And that's why I'm so passionate. And I just want to highlight one thing. When we were talking about Lenny and Gwen, their name, right? Lenny.
Yes,
and Gwen.
you were about to see in the last clip. Yep.
Yeah. That bookstore, first of all, whatever is happening in Toronto was happening in any other city at the time, because there was a bookstore in Winnipeg that was also like a safe Black space on Corden Avenue. And it was featured in a film by Winston Washington Moxham, who was a pioneer Black filmmaker in Manitoba, in his feature film Barbara James. And I always bring up Winston's work because he really captured what it was like to be Black on the prairies in the 90s and early 2000s. And I just love how every Black film I've seen, from like Journey to Justice to Sisters in the Struggle to Our Dance Revolution, like always highlights out how we are communicating to each other without even knowing that we exist.
I love that. That's beautiful. This final film clip, this final film, Book of Love, was directed by Sarah Michelle Brown. It's going to close out our evening tonight. And it closed out the inaugural screening back in 2016. It's a fitting capstone on the lives and legacies of all the activists no longer with us. I also think it's a perfect film that centers a loving couple. It's perfect that the film centers a loving couple in Gwen and Lenny Johnston, who made it their life's work to curate a space for education and community building. So in this clip, you're going to meet Clifton Joseph, a poet, local Toronto legend, whose take on the Johnstons' legacy is everything. When he says they made us feel that we meant something, he's articulating the hashtag that has become both a mantra and a battle cry, Black Lives Matter. He's also echoing James Baldwin when James said, a child cannot be taught by anyone who despises him, and a child cannot afford to be fooled. Let's watch the clip.
They knew that they were inspiring. And that kind of inspiration hits you here, man. Hits you here and it hits you here. Never go away. I miss the place, man. I miss that spot. It ended up after Gwen and Lenny died there, the store closed. But for those of us who were around that time, the Fairville bookstore is not dead. Gwen is not dead. Lenny is not dead. because we knew them, we saw them, we experienced their passion, their compassion, their love for the people, their love for the history. They're the ones who made us feel that we meant something. You know what I mean? You can't get a legacy deeper than that. Somebody that says you are somebody. You come from a long lineage of somebodies. You come from the original peoples of this planet. You come from something divine, glorious. And go out into the world and make your mark, baby. That's the legacy, I think. And we see that legacy reverberating. Even this project, if you will, comes out of that bouncy reverberation of spirit, beauty, wonderfulness, dedication.
I wish we could just watch that right to the end, but we're going to run out of time. We only have 4 minutes. What a beautiful clip and what a beautiful film. Again, folks, if you haven't had a chance to watch all 5 films, do yourself a favor. Go on to ViewKavoo, grab them, hop on, watch them, bring your kids around, watch them again. I love this phrase that Clifton Joseph uses, this bouncy reverberation of spirit. And it's like he's talking about this energy, this life force that really, you know, transcends time and connects us all. And I just think you were kind of alluding to that earlier when you mentioned, you know, what was happening in different cities around Canada at the same time. And so I just think it's a perfect perfect clip to end our evening. We only have a few more minutes. Is there anything that we didn't touch on that you would love to just you know, give about a minute's worth of airtime to?
I don't know. I feel like it was we touched on a lot. I will say one thing.
Short time.
Before we wrap up. You know, there's a lot of we're seeing a lot of Hollywood films now kind of embark on this narrative of Black activism, particularly most recently Judas and the Black Messiah. And I want to bring gender into the fold again, because also too, I didn't realize, even though most of the films were about Black male leaders, they were directed by women. So that's like, you know, another twist. But what I've noticed and what I hope to see more of in Black Canadian cinema, Black American and international cinema, is the priority of like Black women and queer narratives. Particularly, I see it like this. Like, if we think about Judas and the Black Messiah, Malcolm X, Selma, you know, all these stories that really highlight like the Black male struggle and plight. Those were blockbusters. I'm not saying they were easy to make, but they had a big presence in screen. And when we think about other films like Rosa Parks or the story of Miss Jane Pittman, Beloved, you know, a lot of those kind of stayed on a made-for-TV element. And obviously these are African American narratives, but this conversation particularly, and you know, pushing it forward for the conversation around Black cinema in the future, I think that's where I'd love to see the shift, but also prioritizing, you know, the leaders of our past at the same time. But this was a great and very illuminating discussion, and thank you so much for having me.
Alexa, it's been amazing having you here. Like I said, my wing person for the night. It's been fantastic meeting you in this way. I hope one day our paths will cross. I'm sure we'll be in the same space at some point. But for now, the virtual space will have to do. I just want to thank all the filmmakers, my sisters in film, like I mentioned, Sonia Godding Togabo, Ella Cooper, Gaddy Conti-George, Sarah Michelle Brown, and executive producer Allison Duke. Thank you to the good folks at Regina Public Library, Wendy Pert, Eric Hill, Thomas Johnson, Sarah Pittman and Alyssa Farron of the Dunlap Art Gallery, ViewKavoo, and of course, this month's special guest, Alexa Joy. Please, folks, if you're watching, take a moment to fill out an evaluation form. The link has been posted in the comments section. These are anonymous, and RPL Film Theater values your feedback. Remember that the films we spoke about tonight are up for free on ViewCoview until March the 8th. And this is my last evening hosting RPL's Film School, but don't think for a second that this means the fun is going to end. The next film school will be live streamed on Thursday, April 1st at 7 p.m. Central Time on RPL's Film Theater's Facebook and YouTube channels, featuring Charity March and Hajira, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing their name correctly, Hajira Salem Zejiai Gebrihiwat, I think is how you say their last name. I'm sorry if I butchered that. That will be on April the 1st on the RPL Film Theater's platforms. I think that is all we have for tonight. Look at that, 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 8 p.m. Central Time. Alexa, what are you doing tonight? Are you gonna put your feet up and relax, some self-care?
I got homework to do.
Oh, okay, that's right. You're in school still.
Almost.
All right. Well, thank you for taking this time out. And again, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you on the flip side. Take care.
Bye, everyone.